At exactly 10:17 p.m. on a quiet night in 2026, 6 familiar faces appear one after another on the screen: Rita Edochie, PatienceOzokwor, Ngozi Ezeonu, PeteEdochie, Clarion Chukwurah, and Destiny Etiko. No emergency room, no machines, no invented scene of doctors rushing through hospital corridors. What appears instead may feel even more unsettling: the unmistakable passage of time. Gray strands where dark hair once framed famous faces, movements that seem more measured than before. A hand resting briefly on the back of a chair before standing, eyes lingering on photographs taken decades ago. In 2026, the stars who once made millions of Nigerians laugh, cry, fear, and rage are facing an opponent no scriptwriter has ever defeated: time. PeteEdochie, now in his late 70s, carries on his face the weight of decades spent before the camera. PatienceOzokwor and Rita Edochie belong to a generation whose careers have survived enormous changes in Nollywood. Yet advancing age inevitably brings questions about strength, mobility, and the ordinary ailments associated with growing older. Ngozi Ezeonu and Clarion Chukwurah have also crossed decades of relentless work, public scrutiny, personal losses, and changing seasons of life. But here, one line must remain clear: rumors about serious illness should never be confused with confirmed medical facts. Where reliable information is absent, claims of painful diseases, terminal conditions, or rapidly deteriorating health remain unverified, no matter how often they are repeated online. And then there is Destiny Etiko. Younger than the other 5, she becomes the uncomfortable contrast in this picture, a reminder of the years that once belonged to those standing ahead of her. Perhaps she can look at their old films and see something more frightening than aging itself: the knowledge that applause cannot stop the clock. Once, these actors played fathers, mothers, warriors, villains, and women who refused to surrender. Now the question is no longer about the next scene. What happens when people who seemed indestructible on screen begin confronting their own mortality away from it? At 10:17 p.m., the images slowly disappear until only one remains: an old photograph beneath a dim light, its edges slightly faded, while somewhere beyond the frame, an unseen hand reaches toward it. Years earlier, before age became part of every conversation surrounding Nigeria's veteran stars, Rita Edochie seemed to belong completely to the noise of the film set. Bright lights burned above her, crew members moved hurriedly behind the cameras, and then came the director's command: "Action!" In an instant, Rita could become the fierce woman audiences remembered. The commanding voice, the unwavering stare, the explosive emotion that could turn an ordinary confrontation into an unforgettable scene. There was strength in the way she occupied the screen, as though exhaustion belonged to somebody else. But time moves brutally fast when decades are compressed into photographs. The lights fade, costumes disappear, colleagues take different paths, and some familiar faces are eventually seen only in old pictures. By 2026, Rita is no longer simply an actress remembered for powerful roles. She is also an older woman living in a body that, like every human body, must acknowledge the passage of years. Without reliable evidence, it would be wrong to attach a specific disease to her or portray her as gravely ill. What can be said is simpler and perhaps more haunting. Age makes questions about health increasingly important to audiences who have watched her for decades. Imagine Rita sitting quietly before a collection of photographs. Her younger face looks back from one of them. Another contains colleagues from another chapter of Nollywood. Her finger moves slowly across the picture before stopping on a familiar face. For several seconds, nothing happens. No dramatic soundtrack could make that silence heavier. Behind those photographs are careers that changed, friendships tested by time, and painful losses that cannot be rewritten by another take. This is the strange betrayal of aging. The mind can remember running through yesterday, while the body quietly reminds you that yesterday is gone. The woman who could roar through a scene now has to respect ordinary limits that fame cannot negotiate away. Yet there is dignity in that contrast. Rita is still Rita, only the clock has moved forward. Then, just as the room becomes completely still, a telephone suddenly rings. The screen lights up beside the photographs. One name appears across it: PatienceOzokwor. The cameras are rolling again. Voices overlap, footsteps race across the set. Someone adjusts a light, and before the director can finish shouting action, PatienceOzokwor has already transformed. For millions of viewers, she is Mama G, the unforgettable woman whose expressions alone could warn that trouble was coming. One raised eyebrow, one sharp sentence, one furious stare, and an entire scene belonged to her. Through years of Nollywood productions, that energy became so familiar that audiences could almost forget something painfully simple. The woman behind Mama G was growing older while everyone was watching. Then the noise suddenly disappears. It is 2026. Imagine a quiet room, a pair of glasses resting on a table, and an old script with softened, worn edges. Patience is now in her late 60s, and the speed of a film set can no longer symbolize the speed of life itself. There is no responsible reason to invent cancer, a terminal disease, or a hidden deathbed around her. Aging alone carries enough uncertainty. Stamina changes. Recovery after exhausting days may take longer. The body begins setting boundaries that ambition once ignored, and audiences naturally become more concerned about the health of someone they have watched for decades. But perhaps physical aging is only half the story. What happens inside a woman who has spent so much of her life watching people arrive and disappear? Patience has spoken publicly about profound personal loss, including the death of her husband years ago, a chapter that left her raising their children without him. Then there are the quieter departures that accompany a long career, colleagues no longer standing beside you, productions that ended, friendships transformed, familiar sets dismantled, and generations of younger actors arriving where another generation once stood. That may be the cruelest price of longevity, surviving long enough to notice how many chairs around you have changed occupants. Mama G could portray anger, betrayal, and grief before the camera and walk away when the director called cut. Real loss offers no such command. By 2026, every new appearance therefore carries another invisible layer, the distance between the energetic woman audiences remember and the veteran artist who has accumulated decades of memories. Patience slowly removes her glasses. Before her lies an old script, its pages slightly yellowed. She places the glasses beside it and looks toward something beyond the camera. Nobody speaks. The recording light is still glowing. The camera has not stopped, but the room has become completely silent. Then came a photograph. No ambulance, no hospital corridor, no medical announcement, just an image of Ngozi Ezeonu looking noticeably different from the woman millions had carried in their memories. Within hours, comments multiplied. One person said she looked ill. Another insisted she had become too thin. Others began attaching frightening explanations to a body they knew only through a screen. And suddenly, one photograph was being treated like a medical report. But beneath thousands of guesses was the question almost nobody stopped to ask. What had Ngozi herself actually confirmed? This is where the story becomes more uncomfortable, because public concern can quickly turn into something resembling betrayal. Fans believe they are protecting someone they love, yet speculation can transform an ordinary change in appearance into a disease that may never have existed. Ngozi previously addressed concern surrounding her weight loss, rejecting claims that she was sick and explaining that she had deliberately worked on losing weight. That distinction matters. As the years passed and she entered her 60s, however, every visible change naturally attracted greater attention. A thinner face, a different hairstyle, a photograph taken from an unforgiving angle, small details could ignite another wave of fear. By 2026, the audience is no longer simply watching Ngozi Ezeonu, the actress. Many are also watching for signs of aging. Perhaps that is the burden carried by veteran performers. Millions of strangers remember how you looked 20 or 30 years ago and silently compare that image with the person standing before them today. Now return Ngozi to the film set. The lights come on. Makeup is adjusted. Someone places a script into her hands. Across the room stands a mirror, and reflected inside it is not the younger woman preserved in old Nollywood films, but a face shaped by decades of work and life. There is no need to invent a terminal illness to make that image fragile. Time has already written enough across every human face. The director calls for silence. Ngozi raises her eyes toward the camera, prepared once again to become somebody's mother, queen, or grieving woman. Yet somewhere outside the set, another photograph is already being enlarged on a phone screen, and beneath it, the first worried comment appears. There was a time when PeteEdochie needed almost nothing to command a scene. No shouting, no sudden movement. He could sit quietly, lift his eyes toward another character, and the atmosphere would change. That deep voice, the measured delivery, the stern expression. Authority seemed to arrive before his first sentence. For generations of viewers, Pete became the image of the powerful father, elder and traditional ruler, a man who appeared almost impossible to intimidate. Then the years begin moving faster. One film becomes 10, 10 become decades, and suddenly the face preserved in old scenes belongs to another era. Cut to 2026. PeteEdochie is 79 years old. The question is no longer whether he can dominate a room. It is quieter and more unsettling. How long can a human body travel beside a career that refuses to disappear? Age itself is not a disease, and it would be irresponsible to turn every slower movement or changed appearance into a diagnosis. Over the years, public concern about Pete's health has sometimes collided with online rumors, including false reports surrounding his death, demonstrating how quickly fear can outrun verified information. But Pete does not need an invented illness for this chapter to carry pain. He belongs to a generation that has lived long enough to watch familiar faces vanish from the industry. And within his own family came a tragedy no screenplay could reverse. In 2023, his grandson Clarion Chukwurah, the son of Rita Edochie and May, died at only 16. Suddenly, the legendary patriarch audiences associated with strength belonged to a family confronting the kind of loss that leaves no victorious final scene. Years later, the memory remains part of the family's history. Perhaps this is what growing older truly demands, not merely accepting changes in strength, but carrying an increasing number of names, voices, and memories that cannot return. Imagine Pete sitting after the noise of another long day has disappeared. His hands rest quietly before him. The commanding voice is absent. There is no director waiting for another line. Beside him stands a second chair. Empty. Pete looks toward it for a moment, then away. The camera remains fixed on the chair, but nobody explains whose place it is supposed to be. Long before the silence of an empty dressing room could feel heavy, Clarion Chukwurah belonged to another rhythm. The younger Clarion moved beneath blazing studio lights with confidence, changing costumes, learning lines, stepping before cameras, and becoming women whose emotions could fill an entire screen. Years passed almost invisibly at first. Another production, another character, another premiere. But the entertainment industry changed around her. New generations arrived, cameras became smaller, audiences moved onto new platforms, and the woman who had adapted to countless roles eventually faced the one transformation no performer can rehearse: growing older. By 2026, Clarion is in her early 60s. That fact alone does not mean serious illness, cancer, or physical collapse. There is no responsible basis for turning the natural passage of time into a fictional medical diagnosis. Yet aging can carry a psychological weight that is difficult to photograph. Every time news arrives that another artist from an earlier generation has died, mortality seems to move one chair closer. A name once printed beside yours on a poster becomes a memory. A voice once heard backstage survives only in an old recording. And slowly the question changes from what role comes next to something far more intimate. How much time does anyone truly have? Imagine Clarion entering a dressing room after the activity outside has faded. 3 objects remain beneath the mirror lights: a makeup table, several old photographs, and the mirror itself. In one photograph, her younger face seems almost untouched by uncertainty. The woman in the mirror is different. Not defeated, not necessarily sick, simply marked by years the photograph has never experienced. On screen, an actress can disguise exhaustion, grief, fear, and even age. Makeup can soften lines. Lighting can hide shadows. A director can demand another take. But outside the frame, the body never performs a role. It remembers every year. Clarion reaches toward the photographs and lifts one carefully. For a moment, she studies the younger version of herself as though looking at someone she once knew intimately, but can no longer completely reach. Her thumb moves across the edge of the picture. Nothing dramatic happens. No music rises. No one speaks. The camera simply stays there several seconds longer than expected. On the photograph in her hand, the illuminated mirror behind it, and 2 versions of Clarion silently facing each other across decades. And then the rhythm changes. The next face does not belong beside the others because of old age. Destiny Etiko is only in her 30s in 2026, separated by decades from veterans such as PeteEdochie and PatienceOzokwor. There are no gray years to dramatize, no reason to speak of age-related disease, and no justification for placing her inside a story of physical decline. Yet that is precisely why Destiny matters here. She is the bridge between what has already passed and what is still coming. Imagine a crowded Nollywood set. Crew members rush between lights, phones ring, costumes are adjusted, and Destiny stands in the middle of it all, surrounded by the speed that once belonged to every veteran before her. Behind her, hanging almost unnoticed on a wall, are posters carrying faces from an earlier generation. Pete, Patience, Rita, Ngozi, Clarion. Once, they too were among the younger people in the room. Once, decades seemed impossibly distant. Destiny's struggles belonged to a different stage of life. The pressure of remaining relevant, demanding schedules, public scrutiny, and the emotional weight that can accompany a career lived before millions of strangers. Younger bodies are not invincible, and younger stars are not protected from grief, exhaustion, or loss. But those realities must not be transformed into invented illnesses. Instead, Destiny's presence forces the audience to confront something more universal. Aging does not suddenly begin when hair turns gray. It is happening during every premiere, every photograph, and every ordinary morning nobody thinks to remember. Perhaps Destiny looks at those veteran performers differently because she understands that the path beneath her feet was built partly by them. The applause she hears today resembles applause they heard decades earlier. The cameras following her now once followed someone else, and eventually they will turn toward another generation. Destiny steps into position. The director prepares the next shot. Around her are younger actors laughing and talking, while the posters behind them remain perfectly still. For one brief moment, the camera pulls away from Destiny's face and captures the entire room, the young performers in front and the aging faces preserved on the wall behind them. Nobody notices the contradiction. Destiny turns toward the camera as someone calls, "Action!" But the thought remains. One day, the youngest person in the room can become the oldest. It is 10:17 p.m. again. The same hour from the beginning, but everything feels slower now. There is no urgent music, no ambulance outside, no oxygen machine beside a bed, no invented final goodbye. Only 6 lives, separated by distance, age, and memory. The first screen shows Rita Edochie. An old photograph lies quietly on a table, its corners softened by time. Nothing moves except a faint reflection across the glass. Then her screen goes dark. PatienceOzokwor appears next. Her glasses rest beside an old script exactly where they were left. The pages remain open, but nobody turns them. Another screen fades. Ngozi Ezeonu's phone is still glowing. Beneath a photograph are comments from people who care about her, people who worry, and strangers trying to turn appearance into diagnosis. The words continue scrolling even after Ngozi disappears from view. Then PeteEdochie. No dialogue, no commanding voice. He sits quietly, while beside him stands the empty chair nobody has explained. The camera refuses to tell us whom it represents. His screen darkens. Clarion Chukwurah is next. The bulbs surrounding her dressing room mirror switch off one by one until her reflection becomes almost impossible to see. Then Destiny Etiko remains, the youngest of them, still standing on a crowded set while voices and footsteps continue around her. She has not reached the season of life represented by the others, but she is already traveling toward it, as everyone is. And now the voice becomes almost a whisper. Some illnesses are given names by doctors. Some losses are confirmed by families. But some fears begin only because we notice gray hair, a slower step, or a photograph that makes the internet immediately imagine the worst. In 2026, these 6 people still carry 6 very different stories. And perhaps the frightening thing is not that we know what will happen to them, but that we do not know at all. The clock remains at 10:17 p.m. 5 screens have gone black. Destiny's image fades until the room itself disappears. On a nearby table, however, one telephone remains illuminated. Its screen shows an old Nollywood photograph from years ago, 6 younger faces looking toward the camera, frozen inside a moment that believed it had endless time ahead. Somewhere beyond the frame, a door slowly closes. The room becomes silent, but the telephone screen is still glowing.